So Caroline Brettell is University Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at Southern Methodist University and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She has spent her career studying immigrant populations in Europe, especially in Portugal and France, Canada, and the United States. Her particular interests are the gender aspects of migration, issues of identity and citizenship, and the relationship between immigrants and cities. In addition to over 100 journal articles and book chapters, she's the author, co-author, or editor, co-editor of 19 books, including Gender and Migration, Identity and Second Generation, How Children of Immigrants Find Their Place, and Migration Theory, Talking Across Disciplines, in its fourth edition in 2022. So welcome, Caroline, to this interview.
Thank you.
I think you'll start.
Yeah. Hi, Caroline.
Hi, how are
It's
you?
really a pleasure to be here with you. I'll ask you a brief question about your first visit to Portugal.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was your first visit because after a year in France, working with Portuguese immigrant families, you spent 6 months in Portugal, where you arrived, I think it was in the summer of 75. Was this your first visit to Portugal? And also, how was your encounter with the Portuguese rurality? Because in France you work mostly in the cities, in urban areas. So how was this experience on your first visit to Portugal and to Junho?
Yeah. So yes, indeed, it was my first visit to Portugal, and I came down that summer at the invitation of various immigrant families that I was that I'd come to know in France. They were coming back for the summer, and I scheduled a series of visits, and I was really looking for a particular village or freguesia that had women who had remained behind when their husbands had gone to France, which was the other little piece of the story that I was trying to tell about Portuguese women, Portuguese immigrant women, and the ones left behind. So where I ended up was actually the natal village of one of the women who was a close friend and an interlocutor in Paris. I've always been raised in a city. My mother, however, was raised in the west of Canada, and my grandfather was an apple farmer, so my mother kind of knew a little bit about rural life. And I think she was perhaps more terrified for me than I was. But the other thing I should say is my husband was with me at the time, and he was an art historian working on Camille Pissarro. And of course, Pissarro was a great painter of rural life in France in the 19th century. And so it was, I don't ever remember it being that problematic. I was introduced by a member of the freguesia. Her family immediately took us in. We in fact rented a house from a member of her family for the time that we were there. And I think we sort of got into the rhythms of rural life, and it was interesting to us that the kinds of things that we saw in the Musée des Arts et Traditions Populaires in Paris were actually still being used in the fields in Portugal. And I'll always remember a Portuguese friend of mine saying, Portugal entered the 20th century at the very end of the 20th century. So it was a really interesting experience, although I must say I lived in fear of somebody bringing me a live chicken. And I was going to be expected to kill it and pull the feathers out and cook it. But we lived in a house which we cooked over a wood fire. We heated water, and as my husband used to say, we took baths a la Degas, in a bath, and we just got into the rhythm of it. We were young. I don't know that I could do all of that still today, but we really did get into the rhythms of rural life.
Okay, thank you. In Paris, you met, in Poitiers actually, you met Colette Calais-Bavet. Have you met other foreigners that were working about Portugal at that period? And in here, did you meet any anthropologists?
I think the one person I knew in the United States was Joyce Riegelhaupt. Joyce Riegelhaupt had done a study. I think her husband was working as a banker in Lisbon, and when she was very young, and she found a community just outside of Lisbon to do her research. And she was the outside member of my dissertation committee, so I knew Joyce very well, but there was hardly anybody else who had done field work in Portugal. I met Maria Beatriz Rocha Trindade. She had published a book on Portuguese immigrants in Paris, and I really can't remember if it was really when I came to Portugal that I first met her. I don't think I met her while I was in Paris. There were very few people working on, especially ethnographers and anthropologists, working on immigration issues at that point. When I had a Social Science Research Council grant, and they required us to link up with a scholar wherever we were going. And they assigned me to a political scientist at the École des Hautes Études, in Paris. And I went to visit him, and he sort of listened to what my project was about, and he said, well, I'm not so sure I could do anything to help you, but I do have a Portuguese maid. And I said, that will do. That is great help, because you're trying to sort of enter the community. But there were very few scholars, and really when I came to Portugal that first time in the summer of 1975, as I say, I was traveling around looking at various communities trying to pick one. And I very much stayed in the north. And I really didn't make a lot of connections at that time with even sort of scholars in Portugal. And of course it was right after the revolution, and the social sciences and the university, expanding university life was just starting. I think I knew Julieta Rodriguez and her sister Graça. And I think I came down once to Lisbon in that whole period for some kind of conference. But the number of foreigners, and I think João Pina Cabral, I don't know if it was then or a little bit later, was working in a village not too far from where I was, but I didn't know him at the time. And even to this day, at least in North America, there aren't that many people working in Portugal. You know, I mean, you could sort of name them, count them on two hands, and that's it. And some of it is the language. There are many more European scholars, of course, but at the time that I was working, it was also new. To everybody, but Joyce was a valued colleague and friend, and died much too early, and was doing interesting work. And we shared some interest in history and anthropology too, because she was working on Maria da Fonte and all kinds of popular revolution. Exactly. Yeah.
What do you recall about that summer of 1975 as a post-revolutionary context here in Portugal, and how did it impact it, or how did the population react to it when you're staying?
Well, as I recall, that was a summer where there were fires in the north, and there was some burning of communist headquarters. We had a little red VW bug that we had driven all the way from Paris, and we kind of several times became the ambulance for the village, and took people, actually drove them all the way down to Porto. So once or twice we were stopped by the police who wanted to just look in the car. We had American license plates on that car. So I remember that, and I remember people talking about politics and sort of saying, we never used to be able to talk about politics, and
at the village,
in the village level. So occasionally things would start to come out, but it was very politically conservative, and they didn't like communism. Of course, the Catholic Church never liked communism, and so they were getting a lot of words like that. But I don't remember that I felt particularly threatened, and of course their attitude was, this revolution is Lisbon's revolution.
Okay.
Up here in the north, we continue our lives. And when I wrote that paper for a meeting of something called the International Conference Group on Modern Portugal, which was founded right before I left to go to Paris, and it was really interesting because there were a lot of political scientists in that group who had been working on Brazil, and all of a sudden Portugal became interesting. So they all jumped on jumped on the bandwagon to sort of start looking at Portugal. But when there was this conference, it was in Toronto in 77 or 78, and I was one of the few people who'd actually been in the country and been out there. So I wrote this paper called Emigration and Its Implications for the Revolution in the North. And the real argument was, immigration is what really has sustained this community and brought more change to it than the sort of politics of revolution. But that change was going to go on, I think, much more slowly, and I can't comment on the present. But one didn't really see the impact there. So, for me, it was okay. I could see the impact of immigration on the village, the religious festival. And the participation of the immigrants and the return migration or temporary return process. These are the kinds of things that I could see sort of slowly changing, or the building of houses, right, and the investment in the community. But so it was very much Lisbon's revolution. But I'll tell you that my mother wrote to me. And she said, I hope you keep the car full of gas so that if petrol, so that if something happens, you can make a quick escape. And I wrote back and I said, Mother, the only place to quick escape is to Franco's Spain. But I was listening to the conversations, but I think the people were sort of slow to sort of deal with the political freedom. There was a lot of complaint about the retornados.
And what sort of complaint?
Well, I think that this was a population coming back, and they were being favored, and some people started showing up in the village because they had family members in the village, and they're being treated specially by the government, and there was a little bit of resentment about all of that. We've been able to take care of ourselves, and we go abroad and we save up money or we send back money, and all of a sudden they're getting whether true or not. That was the perception. So there's some of that, which was of course linked to the revolution.
So the revolution, the political change didn't quite land. Other than being suspicious of the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. They were very PDP at the time. What they are now, I have no idea, because I haven't gone back. But we were aiming to focus in 1975.
So you returned to Portugal to continue your work in the archives in the 90s, I think in the beginning of the...
the 80s, the early part of the 80s, because the second book came out in 86, so I was,
So in the 80s, when you returned, what difference did you find in the country? Because the Portuguese anthropology was developing in the democratic period. How did you find...
I'm not very good at answering that question because, again, every time I came to Portugal, I sort of, went back up to the north. So I didn't, it's only later that I really spent some time in Lisbon when I was working on the Goans, which I think we'll get to. Things were slow to change. I was so focused on this archival research. And I can explain how I got into that, but it's just the rhythms of life went on. I think when I was first there, the power of the priest in the village was very strong, and I think probably by the time I came back in the 80s and almost a decade had passed, that was a little less true. So people were starting to sort of question some sort of ways of life that they had been operating according to for quite some time.
And there was probably some return migration at that period?
There were a lot of houses being built, and there was some return migration, but not fully. But there were people starting to come back who'd gone out in the 1960s and invested in it. But those decisions, I think, are very complicated for immigrants because of where your children and grandchildren want to stay, right?
And did you feel like the population of the village was still very conservative and
suspicious
I think so. In a way of what was happening in Lisbon?
Still very conservative and feeling like that, that's distanced. But young people were starting to move, stop doing agricultural work and move into teaching and things like that, and the possibilities in the area or just commuting to a city to do work. There was some changes starting to happen there where ideal positions and work were changing. It was ideal if you could get a job in a restaurant as a young boy as a server. Well, that was going away, and they had a little bit more different kinds of ambitions. But it's slow to change, and I really do think that immigration still at that period of time was having more impact on just bringing resources into the village.
Of course,
Yeah.
in the 80s, absolutely, yes,
Right.
you're right.
Yeah.
I agree with you. After that second visit, you came back again, now in the 90s, and then in the early 21st century, to look at another group,
Right.
the Goan migration community established in Lisbon at that time. So with the Goan community, you entered a new context of Portuguese migration, which is the post-colonial movement some out of Goa, some out of Africa, coming to Portugal. So how did you observe this new trend and this new flow, more than a trend, in the Portuguese migration with the Goan communities?
Right. So I really would like to get back to the archival research a little bit later, because that's an important phase. But I'll tackle this one first. But so when I stopped working on Portugal by the sort of mid-1990s and started focusing on. By that time, I was well established in Dallas, and I had noticed that Dallas was becoming very diversified in terms of its immigrant population, and thought nobody's studied this and nobody really realizes what's happening here, and it's more than just Hispanics. And so we developed this large-scale research project on new immigrants in the Dallas area, and one of the communities we were looking at was Asian Indians, and that was particularly the community that I was working on in Dallas. And as a part of that research, I met a young woman who had Goan origin, and we would just engage in conversations. And at this parallel time, one of my colleagues, Ruth Feijó, kept writing me saying, you need to turn your attention to immigrants in Portugal, that in Portugal, which for generations had been descending society, like many of the other Southern European countries, was becoming a receiving society, receiving immigrants. So there's been this transformative change in the 1990s and into the 21st century. And I just listened to him because I was doing other things, but I thought, that would be kind of interesting, and the Goan connection to the Indians. So I decided that summer, and I don't know that I think that summer I was really coming to see whether there was a viable research project and who else, and Jorge Malheiros was one of them, who was in Lisbon working on Indians and Goans. So it was a kind of exploratory trip for only about 5 weeks.
Okay.
That I came to Lisbon, and it really was the first time that I'd spent any time in Lisbon. And so there you are. I've been coming to Portugal since 1975, and finally I was actually
in the capital.
I was in the capital.
Okay.
And because I had all this archival research behind me, and really fundamentally believed that you needed to have an historical perspective in anthropology and see how things accumulated in some way to be where they were now. During that summer, I did a lot of archival research because I was just interested, in what happened in the 1960s that brought that first generation of Goans to Portugal. And so it was a combination of lots of hours in the Biblioteca Nacional. I just got fascinated by the conflict between Salazar and Nehru, over the, and Nehru referred to Goa as a pimple on the face of India. So I got fascinated in that and laying the groundwork for it. And then through the Casa de Goa, I was able, and through some connections I actually brought with me from the United States, at least there was one person I interviewed who was related to or a friend of, I really can't remember precisely, of the Goan lady I had met in Dallas. And so through the Casa de Goa, I met a few people and conducted a few interviews, and I guess wrote this one article, which is one of my more widely read and cited articles. I mean, there's just some interest in it. And sometimes I hear from Goans, and they're interested in it. I went back and got immediately involved in another project on citizenship practices. So I never extended beyond that summer of field research, the research on the Goans. But they came here, and some of that first generation, as I write about in that article, went then back out to the colonies. And so that's my only use in my writing of the concept of post-colonialism. I mean, because I've gone back to really working on topics that don't really have that kind of context and framing, but it was really important for talking about that first generation of Goans, and probably,
the ones that followed,
and ones that followed, but the stories they told about coming here and then being these kind of interstitial individuals, going out into the colonies until, of course, that all collapsed and they all had to come back to the metropole, were sort of fascinating stories of mobility, and different forms of mobility.
So we can return to the archives.
I'd love to. Look, I don't know if you want to ask or if you want me to just talk.
No, it's very important that we have this question about your experience in these mainly parish archives. So what memories do you have of this field work in the archives, and also this relationship between oral history and the work with the archives?
So the background to that was that when I returned from the 2 years in Europe in the fall of 1976, my husband and I went to the University of Texas at Austin. He had a position, I was finishing my dissertation. I met an historical demographer there named Myron Gutman, who was also a new faculty member. And he was teaching a class on family history and historical demography. And I had told him that when I was in the village, I was in the priest's house, and I saw all of these records of births, deaths, marriages, and whatever else. And I thought, what do you do with them? Well, he gave me a context and a framework for what you do with them. And I sat in on his class, and then I wrote a proposal for a postdoc to do this work. I mean, and he gave me sort of the methodology to do it. Again, there were historical demographers and family historians working on these kinds of archives already in other countries of Europe, but nobody, except for maybe Robert Rowland, who was somebody in Portugal at the time, and I met him at the time. Nobody was really doing it systematically here, and and more people came into it. But it requires a lot of patience and a lot of hard work. I mean, you were sitting, and in those days, pre-computer, a lot of, I photocopied some, but I would sit and there were the archives in the village, which I was able to take into Viana to Castello and actually copy with the permission of the priest. There were a whole bunch of other materials in Braga, so I would go down to Braga and just sit in the archives and copy in notebooks, marriage records and birth records. There was one question about ethics and things that I learned, or the interface between oral history and archival history. I learned things from those archives, and I knew the descendants of the families, or I knew something that the archives told me that they didn't have as a public story. For example, out of wedlock births, and I can think of one case in particular, that it wasn't sort of widely known or talked about. And so you have to wrestle, I think, as an anthropologist with how you deal with that. And of course you can always replace names. Or I would have this experience. There was a wonderful elderly man with a wonderful memory named João de Barreiros. And he had been an immigrant in Brazil. And I mean, he just had a wonderful historical perspective. But I would come to his house and ask him things about what I was seeing in the archives. And he would just smile and say, well, how do you know that? I remember that person, because I was just learning all this stuff from reading the archives, and then he would fill in some of the details. Whereas in other European countries, there are population registers, and for example, my friend and colleague David Kurtzer was working at the time in Italy on this topic. I didn't have that in Portugal, but I found these rochas confessados, which once a year would give you the household and the members of the household, and that's really what gave me the data on migration and who was present and who was absent, as best as I could handle it, which became really important for seeing gaps in the fertility of women. And this was very much a project, where there's a chapter on fertility, there's a chapter on marriage, there's a chapter on illegitimacy in men who migrate, women who wait. But I will say that, and this is an interesting anthropological thought, that generation of Americans or North Americans who worked in Europe and got interested in the intersections of anthropology and history and learned the methods of family history and historical demographer. I mean, there are several books I could say. There's David Kurtz's work, there's Bill Douglas's work. There were several really important books that in anthropology and history and family history that sort of came out in the 80s, the latter 80s. And so that was pretty unique, and I think we felt as anthropologists working in Europe that we had a kind of archival historical depth that was accessible to us that anthropologists working in Africa or other kinds of places, although again, records have turned up, but I really enjoyed that. And then after that book, I got interested in property and inheritance, so I came back 1 or 2 summers, I can't remember. By that time, a lot of the archives had been moved to Viana do Castelo, and they were opening them up more. I mean, again, this was this sort of process of academic change and intellectual change in Portugal that was just, and probably the demand of people of your generation for, just opening
access,
up and giving access. But so I spent, a couple of summers just working in Viana also on those notarial records, and that was pretty productive work too. I think I got about 3 articles out of that work, and it was really interesting. And reading Jack Goody and thinking about property and inheritance and the moral economy of peasant life. Anyway, they were all those peasant quotes.
Thank you.
Okay, now we would like to address your research as a whole from now onwards, and focus on the challenges of comparison between all the Portuguese communities you have addressed in very different spatial and very different temporal contexts, and which lines of continuity, which structural lines, if we can talk about it, you find in all those ethnographies about Portuguese migration in different spaces, such as the United States, Canada, and France, to mention some.
Well, I think the gender issues are present in all contexts, and they may take some variations because the migration patterns take some variation. I mean, in the migration to France, in the really first generation of Portuguese migrants in France, which was the generation that I captured, that was very much of a men go first. Women have followed. Sometimes they followed as wives. Sometimes they went on their own because there were really employment opportunities in France for single women. Versus in the U.S. in the Rhode Island area and in the Toronto area, of course, fewer mainlanders and more Azorians. So that's the place of origin from within Portugal, the dominant place of origin. Not to say that there weren't some mainlanders in those contexts, but that in itself, I think, sort of created a difference. And those were more family migrations from the start. And of course, we as anthropologists, even though we work from the bottom up, and we really work with the interlocutors and the people who are actually experiencing whatever it is that we're looking at, we need to be cognizant of, the macro kind of perspective. And there, I think, we need to be cognizant of the immigration policies and how those structure particular patterns of migration. But I would say one of the big things, even though I was focused on Portuguese migrant women in Paris, because I realized by the time that I got there, they were following, and there were different patterns. Some of them were couples who had left their children behind with mostly the maternal grandmother, and they were trying to earn a lot of money so they could build their house and come back. There were single women. I mean, the woman who introduced me to the village where I ended up in Portugal was one of those single women, who'd come on her own. She had a child out of wedlock, and you know, she wanted to earn some money to help the child, and she'd gone off to France. She had a sister and a brother-in-law in France, in fact, nieces and nephews. So she had a link.
Okay.
But you wouldn't necessarily find somebody like her in the North American. I'm not to say they don't exist, but it was much more, you know, family migration, and I think that has to do with the policies. You know, I mean, the U.S. policy is based on kinship connections and family sponsorship. The Canadian policy at the time that I was doing that work, that was even in the summer of '72, earlier than even working in France or in Portugal. It was less, the point system that they now have and the skills emphasis that they now have was a little more amorphous at that period of time. But you know, they encouraged families to come, and that's what happened. So that's one connection. I've always, you know, we were mentioning that I've been interested in cities. One of my old articles was an article that posed the question, is the ethnic community inevitable?
Yeah.
And that was something, you know, in critiquing my own training and the assumptions that are made about the immigrant experience derived from theory that, you know, you get these ethnic enclaves in cities. And I came from that kind of theoretical background and landed in France and found this Portuguese communities, you know, dispersed, and really dispersed more in association with the nature of female employment, at least looking in the city itself, because they were getting housing through the wives being maids or being concierges.
Yes.
And then they were in the arrondissement too, but dispersed.
Yes.
And there was no, you know, because anthropologists, when they work in cities, are often looking for a neighborhood where they can find a lot of informants, whereas I did what I called subway anthropology, or sur le métro.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I was all over the city of Paris, finding people to interview through various points of entry. So that experience, whereas in Toronto, they were concentrated in the Kensington Market area.
Yes.
Again, not to say
At
that they
the time.
weren't, at that time they were concentrated. And not to say that there weren't Portuguese families, you know, dispersed in the sort of near-in suburbs of Toronto. But so, you know, that's the first time I started to think about the city as context, and the city itself, you know, structures the residential patterns and may therefore have implications for how they form community, how they relate to one another. Very important in Paris were the churches. You know, that was one place where they could come together. And there were a lot of French churches at the time finding a Portuguese priest and doing a mass in Portuguese in a side chapel or something. So we, in fact, we found one in Neuilly with a charming Portuguese priest, and my husband was pianist. And so that's where we started. He started playing the harmonium for the masses, and we started teaching them, you know, hymns and things like that. So the priest would bring in things and say, can you teach them how to sing this? And we continued that in the village in Minho. So we would practice on Saturday night and then do the 7 a.m. mass. And I'm not a Catholic, so I just kept that quiet.
Okay. So you were doing these transnational connections between the cities where people were living and their places of origin.
Yeah, you know, and I when I collected some of my essays in the book Anthropology and Migration, which I think I published in 2003, they were, you know, I collected a whole bunch of these essays because I thought, and even though there are more people working on the Portuguese in the U.S. now, in terms of the general public, there's not a lot of awareness of the presence of the Portuguese, except if you're up and down the East Coast. But in the, you know, I mean, the Hispanic and Spanish-speaking population so dominate in the U.S. that there's not a whole lot of awareness of the presence of the Portuguese or the deep historical roots of the Portuguese in the United States. And I thought that book might contribute a little to it. But I remember saying in that book that, you know, in the mid-'70s, I was studying transnationalism, but we didn't have the word yet. And I'm not one of those anthropologists that has necessarily neologized and created new words, but it made me wrestle with what did I mean by return migration? How is return migration different from transnationalism? You know, and I was capturing this, and I think it gets back to the question too about comparison, that you can do the comparisons between the Portuguese in different in different receiving societies.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think it's really important for migration scholars to draw, you know, their population isn't unique. There are some things that are shared by all migrants, no matter what their national origin, no matter where they've settled. That's part of the migrant experience.
Yeah.
And I do think people need to read really broadly. And it was interesting to me when I went back and read the article on immigration and its implications of the revolution in the North, that I actually, in that essay, draw some comparisons with the Mexican Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it surprises me now that I was doing that. I was such a young scholar at the time, and I thought, well, this is really interesting, that obviously that urgency to compare and to think through comparison was very present for me right from the beginning. And I think, you know, lots of times scholars think they're inventing something new, but if they actually read broadly, you
That's
know,
already there in a way.
Yeah.
I agree with you, and I absolutely agree with you when you say that there's something that it's common to all migration experiences in some way. And going back to these so-called communities, Portuguese communities, in different contexts and with different transnational experiences, how would you characterize broadly their relationship with their origins and with the different spatial host societies that they encounter in their migration experiences?
Oh, well, I guess the first thing I could say is that I worked a lot, and I don't know that we do this much as anthropologists anymore, but I actually worked with genealogical diagrams, and of course, you know, your interlocutors would get fascinated by it, you know, we were drawing these little triangles and circles and doing a genealogy, but I used it, and I tell my students in my social organization, or, you know, the kinship and anthropology class, I used it to help me deal with the migration experience, because I would say, well, you know, how many brothers and sisters, and where is that person living, and where is that person living, and so I would get the migration history, you know, and it goes back to what I gathered from oral history that sort of paralleled what I was getting from.
So mapped.
It's a map that way, and they really knew a lot about where their relatives have gone, and it was a really global dispersal, which I think is, you know, part of the Portuguese experience, and again gets back to the, you know, the colonial, you know, we look out across the Atlantic. We've gone
the imperial gaze.
The imperial gaze, exactly, and so they, you know, kind of knew a lot about that. I equally, I mean, the individual who sort of first made me aware of the Portuguese migration stream to France way back when was somebody in Toronto. And I was living in this house in the Kensington Market area, and there were two families in the house, and I had the room in the attic. And one family was from the Azores, and the other family was from the north of Portugal, from Minho. I can't remember exactly where they were from. He had been in France and working as a single man, having left his wife and his two children back in the village. And then, you know, he had heard about Canada and the opportunities in Canada, come back to Portugal, picked up his family, and emigrated to Canada. So, you know, that sort of, you know, reflects, you know, people who are aware of different kinds of opportunities and experiences. And then all these people at that time, you know, had relatives in Brazil, you know, that they sort of loosely kept in touch with or knew. I can remember just as I was leaving one time, and I think it wasn't the first time, but it was in that time when I was back, a young boy was leaving with his uncle to go to Venezuela. You know, and that to me was a reflection, again, here's a new opportunity, here's a new destination. You know, we have some kinspeople we know there, and off this young boy went. How long he stayed, whatever, I sort of lost touch with that. What else have I not answered? In relationship to your question, it was a long, complicated question.
No, I think you're just missing, if anything, how to contextualize the relationship with origin in all these different places. If you could find, you know, similar traits in the way that these people refer to Portugal or to their local, you know, villages, or
well,
not.
you know, it theoretically, the anthropologists that more recently have sort of talked about the culture of migration, and now I'm blanking on his name at Ohio State, Jeff, I'm blanking on his name. Anyway, he writes about this in Mexico, and I think Doug Massey, as a sociological demographer, sort of alluded to some of this, and I think that's so deeply rooted in Portugal, and it's rooted in some cultural dimensions of being Portuguese and the deep history of emigration, that may make the Portuguese experience slightly, different in terms of diasporic connections, or are we thinking about the homeland? However, what it's like for the third or fourth generation, even though I have a sense that they're still going back to the homeland. They were introduced by their parents or grandparents to the homeland, and they still kind of feel a connection. And at least in the North American context, there's a lot of the right to be different, and the notion of cultural citizenship, and that we can keep these dimensions of ourselves that that are different, that then undergird, I think, those attachments to the homeland and of sort of being transnational. Huge debate theoretically, I think, between the anthropologists who see all these transnational connections and hear people talking about it, and the sociologists who think it's temporary. There's a huge theoretical debate, and it's going to disappear with the first generation, and I'm not sure that that's the case. And of course, there are also these nation states, who are giving people the privilege. They want to maintain their citizenship and and their connections, or giving them the right to vote, or giving them the opportunity of dual citizenship. So that's also going on globally in some contexts.
And that does play a part. A huge part.
Right.
Regarding to this, we would also like to ask you about if you think there is a kind of gender dimension in this transnational mobility. For example, the role of women in maintaining these transnational networks.
Well, I think the interesting thing there is the whole concept of transnational motherhood, about which there's a lot that's been written, particularly the literature I know. It's quite strong amongst Mexican women in the United States to have that kind of connection where they actually left their children behind, as I found one pattern amongst the Portuguese in the 1970s in Paris, but didn't have the vocabulary to speak about it. But they were transnational mothers, and I think what's really interesting, and they maintain the connections. They think it's maybe better for their children, to be back in the village, but they're going to, assume responsibilities that may not be traditionally associated with motherhood, and and they take on the economic responsibilities that have been traditionally been associated with fatherhood. I also think, I don't know how I want to say this. Women are often responsible, for the sort of values and other things within the household context, and some of that has to do with, cultural dimensions or traditions or practices, with about family and identity, and they tend to sort of work on it more. Now, that said, I just had, I had a young Spanish scholar, was a visiting scholar at SMU just the last 2 months, and she's going to, I think, do a PhD at the University of Barcelona, and she was interested in transnational fatherhood, and I just got an email from her yesterday, because I was working with her and advising her just before I left on this trip, and she said she'd managed to do some interviews with transnational fathers, and she was telling me in these interviews that she had these men crying because they left their children behind, and the kind of responsibilities of that. So I guess I'm talking more about how these migrants work in a transnational space and to kind of keep it all together. That's one dimension, and the other is just maintaining one's heritage, maintaining one's cultural practices, and there I do think that maybe women have more to do with it, but we mustn't underestimate the impact, emotional and affective impact of migration on fathers as well as mothers. So
we are coming to an end, so 2 more to go. Yesterday we talked a lot about diversity in migration, and we talked about typologies and how they are useful in our work. to organize and establish patterns within all this diversity that we can find in migrations today. I wanted to know if it's possible to identify the most visible typologies that we use today in general terms, and why are these dominant compared with other typologies?
Well, the most visible one is the difference drawn between refugees and economic migrants, right?
Okay.
And that, I think, is encoded in policies. And if nation states draw differences, and the political asylees are somewhere out there too, but if nation states draw those differences and just by doing that create differential experiences in terms of what happens when you cross the border, how you can cross the border, that I think is something we have to deal with it, whether we're going to criticize it or we're going to work with it. So I think that's the one that's probably the most controversial, because then it leads to all kinds of other, the animosity toward that we see in the United States right now towards economic migrants, and this way that they're characterized and flooding across the border, or why are we giving them all political asylum? And political asylum, you're supposed to cross the border and then claim it. But now in the last two regimes in the United States, you've had them staying on the other side of the border, which completely defies the whole. And I think, in the U.S. context, I'm not even sure the general public really understands the whole refugee regime. And the rights that it accords people. They just see people of different background who don't speak our language and blah, 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 blah. More theoretically, I guess what I would say, so that's, I think, the most controversial one that challenges us, whether we're going to deal with it as scholars or we're going to deal with it as human beings and political and, what our position is. Legal, illegal is another typology or categorization that again comes from elsewhere, but I think we have to wrestle with it. And there's a lot of, I think, good literature by anthropologists and others sort of dealing with that, the adjectivity of undocumented status or sans-papiers, as they would represent it in France, and what that means for shaping people's experience. So those are very real. The way that policy and governmentality, sets out difference is very real to the experience of migrants, I think, and so it's incumbent upon us. The only other thing I'd say about typologies, and early on, as I write about in the essay in Migration Theory, it was about types of migration, of which these are some of them. But short-term, circular, whatever. I mean, when people have laid those out, I think they're a place to start. They're not a place to finish.
Of course.
That you can, they help you realize that there may be factors that shape experience in different ways because of how people move, and whether it's temporary or it's more permanent, and whether it's an ideal to be more permanent or an ideal to be temporary but it becomes more permanent. They're just useful ways to begin, but they're not where you want to end. And in the early days, I think that's where articles ended. Right?
Okay.
Lay out the typology, there you are.
Yes.
And to me, that's just only a start. It helps you just, begin framing things.
Thinking about them. So our last question, examining migrants' voices and life experiences in literature was a topic of your conference yesterday. Would it be possible to identify a common trait in these narratives about the migration experience? If one has to produce a portrait of American based on these literary materials, which features of American culture would stand out in your opinion?
So as I said yesterday, a lot of these novels, first of all, they're debut novels, and they're usually written by first or second generation. Either people who were born abroad and came at a young age, or what we would call the 1.5 generation actually, in the United States. People who came as young children, or people who came on their own. They're not to say that there aren't second and maybe even third generation who were engaging in this. But I think the strongest theme that comes out is it's the issues of identity. And I think anthropologists and ethnographers are very comfortable working with the concept of identity. I find my colleague Jim Hollifield, who co-edited Migration, he doesn't want to touch he doesn't want to touch identity. economists don't want to touch
Yeah,
identity.
no.
Sociologists might, you know, but
I don't know.
no,
I'm not
yeah,
sure.
Yeah, and so I think it's really something that ethnographers feel comfortable with, and I find in those novels that notion of bicultural identity or struggling with one's identity and thinking about one's relationship to where one was born or where one's parents were born and the sort of roots kind of element of that and how that sort of shapes your experience and shapes your outlook, and negotiating. And a lot of what I talked about yesterday, because the authors themselves use it, is this concept of translation, and that these individuals are, constantly trying to translate for themselves or for
Mediate between.
mediate between, I mean, either mediating
Cultural
between themselves and
identities.
their parents, or helping their parents deal with,
Yeah.
or their own kind of experience, or situational identity, and being American in one context and being very Cuban or very Indian or very Haitian in another context. That those young people are, code switching is really what's the way we talk about it in anthropology. So I think that's a very powerful theme, particularly in these debut novels, because those are the ones that come, from inside them and from their own experience. That's the one, as I quoted Cristina Garcia yesterday, wants to come out.
Yeah.
Now these authors then move on to all kinds of other things in later novels. So I'm particularly interested in these debut novels, which is almost like them putting down their own life history, but in a fictionalized form, or their own life experiences, but in a fictionalized form. So I think that's really the most powerful theme that I've found in this literature. Now somebody else reading different novels might find something different, or I may
Or in a different context.
or in a different context. But I think that's something that I really see coming over. And as I said yesterday, I think these are really powerful texts to teach with, because
Narratives.
students like narratives, they like stories, they can remember stories. And it's just our job to say, well, this is a fictional account, but how does it relate to issues that we look at as social scientists in the study of migration? So.
Okay,
Thank
that's
you
it.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline.
Alright.
It was a pleasure
Good.
and an honor, and we learned again a lot
Okay,
from
good.
you.
Good. Thank you very much. My pleasure. It's lovely to be in Lisbon.
It's lovely to have you. Okay.